Now let's focus on reading data out of our Redux store. So in the last videos, we talked about how we can basically add data to this Redux store and populate it. Now we want to work on the opposite, getting data out of it, right? So this is acting like our front-end database, and we're going to try to read information out of it now. We're going to do that with a library called reselect, okay? So reselect is put out by Redux, and it basically is a way of just fetching information out of the Redux store with things called selectors. So you can define a selector and basically teach it how to fetch information from the state. So if you look at this basic example here, you can see like a shop item selector is just a function, and it accepts the Redux state object as an argument, and it just knows how to fetch items out of it. It knows that the items are in the state.shops.items namespace. And you can create it like this. You can basically just say create selector and then pass in the selector function that we just defined. And you can format the return value, right? So this is basically just using reduce inside of it on the items. You can do all kinds of stuff, right? You can calculate, do calculations inside of it. This is like the tax selector. So if you had a subtotal and a tax percentage, you could do some math here to get the actual tax. All right, so it does more than just simply fetching data out of it. It also formats it or, does math on it or something like that, right? So we're going to use reselect pretty heavily to fetch all the data out of our Redux store. So as an example, if we go to our app and we go to the state and we see, Web3, we can create a basic selector to just get the account out of here, or we can create a selector to get the Web3 connection or anything like that. Okay, so I will walk you through all that step by step, and we're going to add a whole lot more stuff to this state as we continue building out the app, and we'll create a whole lot of selectors in order to read it out and also do math and stuff. So that's the goal. So let's create our first selector. All right, we'll just follow this example. So I'll just copy this, and I'm going to create a new file inside of here. It'll be in the store directory. So let's go to our terminal and say touch source, say store, and then we'll call this selectors. Okay, so we'll see new files created inside of here. And I'm just going to paste in that first example from the GitHub repo. So create selector is a function that comes out of reselect, which we've already installed in the package.json file whenever we added the dependencies for the project. And we can create a basic selector like this. So we have the shop item selector that's going to read state and fetch shop items. So we don't have that, but we want to select our own information or data from the state. So first, let's just create a basic account selector. So like I said, we have an account here in Redux. We'll see here, state, web3, account. We can get that out of there. All right, so we can say state, web3, account. All right, and then I'm going to change the naming convention a little bit. I'm just going to call this account. And then the actual selector is going to be export const account selector. And we'll just say create selector, and I'll pass in the account. And I'll just return it as is. We're not going to do any formatting on it. So instead of passing in some function that would do something with the account, we're just going to return it directly. I could do that with a very simple arrow function like this. We could say account. That will be the argument that gets passed into this anonymous function, and that will just return account. Okay, so this can be expressed a few different ways. We could do it like this, right, and then like this, or we could pass in keyword function, right, and then do the curly braces. But I'm just gonna do it really shorthand. And I'm going to make it even shorter than that. I'm just going to say A. So there's no conflict with this account right here. All right. So that's a really succinct way of creating a selector just to fetch this from the state. And And this will be a common pattern that we'll use when we want to just fetch routine items from the state. Okay. So now I actually want to make this a little more robust. Like, what happens if web3 doesn't exist? Well, we're going to be calling a count here on something that doesn't exist, and it's going to blow up. So I'm going to use a special helper. I'm going to import get from Lodash. All right, so I'll show you what that is. We'll actually just open Lodash here. I bet I can search on GitHub. So Lodash is just a library that's going to give us a lot of nice functions in JavaScript. So particularly, we're going to use get. So what does get do? All right, I'll pull it up here and we'll see. Let's just search for it. All right, get. So get gets the value path for an object and returns undefined or some default value if it doesn't exist. So you can see how that works here. Basically, we can get these nested keys from an object and provide a default value if it doesn't exist. That's going to prevent this from blowing up if web3 doesn't exist whenever we try to read it out of the object. So I'll do this. I'll say get state and then web3.account. And we'll be using get quite a bit throughout this bootcamp in order to prevent these kinds of errors. All right, so let's save that. Let's actually try to use this. We'll fetch it inside of our main component here. Go to components, app.js, and let's actually import it. So I'll just say, we'll do import account selector from store selectors. All right, I'll save that. And now what I'll do is actually take that account selector and I'll go down here where we have access to state. All right, so map state to props. It's going to pass state in, and then I'll just say account. It's going to equal to account selector, and I'll pass in the state. All right, so that's how we do it. And I can log it to the console inside the render function. I'll just say console.log. Let's say here this.props.account. All right, here we go. So let's go to the browser and see what happened. We can go to our app, open the console, and we can see the account is logged here. Awesome. So our selector is working. It's successfully fetching all the data out of the Redux store. All right. So that is a huge hump that we've gotten over, and we're going to be able to use this pattern and create more advanced selectors as we continue to build out this exchange. But that is sort of the basic way that you do this. Okay. So let's move this around and do some refactoring a little bit. The first thing I want to do is actually use this account. I want to display it in the exchange somewhere. So I want to put it here on the nav bar. All right. And I actually want to make this nav bar look nicer. I don't want these dead links. I don't want it to say nav bar. I want it to actually, say the name of our exchange and show the account. Okay. So I'm going to remove this code because we're not going to log it at the console anymore. We don't care about having the account selector here. And I'm going to take it out of here. All right. So let's go back to to-do, fill me in. Okay, so I'm going to take the nav bar, all this code, and actually put it into a new component, right? So I'm going to render it out here so we don't just see this massive, markup inside of our app.js component. And when we do that, we're going to refactor a little bit, and we're going to actually put the account in there, okay? So we can render we can render the nav bar by creating a new component. We'll go ahead and do that. I'll just create it in the same directory. I'll say navbar.js. All right. And now I'm just going to go ahead and paste in the code for the navbar like this. Boom. All right. So this should look somewhat familiar. We've done a lot of this stuff in React already. So I don't want to belabor the really boring, repetitive stuff. I just want to show you how it works. So we moved all this code down into the component, all right, inside of here. Got the same nav, the class name navbar, etc., etc. but I've changed the name, right? So this is DApp token exchange. It doesn't just say navbar anymore. All right. And I took away those links, and I also added the account. Okay. So how does this work? Well, we're going to add the navbar here in a second, but basically what happens is we have used our same pattern that we just implemented in that top level component that I logged at the console. So we fetched the account from the state, right, with the account selector. We've imported that. And so the account is equal to the account selector from state, right? Boom. That provides that information to props, which get passed into the render function with React, all right? And then we can list out the account inside the component like this. So React uses these curly braces to allow us to evaluate JavaScript code within our HTML, okay? So we use these curly braces to say this.props.account and put it inside our HTML code, all right? So our account is also going to be a link to Etherscan, right? So if you remember Etherscan from the token section, the intro to tokens, I show you how to use the block explorer, and it's going to show you a link to our account, and you'll be able to see all your transaction history on the actual blockchain. Okay. So let's take a look. In order to view this in our browser, we have to render out the navbar component. All right. So first, we need to pull it into our main component here. We'll basically just import it. Let's do it below here. Let's say import navbar. All right. So I'll refresh this. Actually, sorry, not refresh yet. Now let's render it out. So we'll clear out the old navbar code. All right. And then we'll render our new component for the navbar like this. We'll just say navbar. All right. Refresh the page. Boom. There we go. There's our new navbar with the DApp token exchange name. And we've also got our account listed here that was pulled out of the Redux store with the selector and added to the component. So just a quick refresher. You know, we pulled it out of the state here with our selector, actually, right? Account selector. We passed the state in when we did that, which comes from map state to props. We turned it into an account variable that's attached to props. It gets injected into render, and we render it out here, right? And that's what allows us to show the account. And we also create a link to Etherscan like this. So we can click on that. And we can see all the transaction data for the account on the main Ethereum network, which it doesn't have any yet because we haven't done anything. But there you go. Awesome. So that's the new navbar, and that's how you create, child components in React. That's how you use selectors. That's how you put data from the blockchain into your React components. Very cool. So we've overcome another big hump. Now let's move all of this code into its own subcomponent as well. All right. We'll just call this, we'll call it content, okay? So we'll call content.js. Inside of here, we want to create a component that just manages all the content, a lot like we did our navbar. It's going to look very similar, and we're just going to paste in the same markup that was in this top level component like this, right? We take all of this and just put it in a component just like the navbar, okay? So I'm not going to make any modifications to the HTML code. I'll just paste in the content example like this, okay? So let's look at this. We just import React and component and connect from Redux just like the navbar. We're not going to use any selectors yet because we don't need to fetch any data. It's just basic HTML at this point. All right, and then inside of here, we just put all the standard markup that was in this same place here. And at the bottom, we just have map state to props, and we just have content, all right? So let's save that and make sure everything looks good. All right, looks good, looks good. Now inside of app.js, we'll pull in the content as well. Say import content. All right, and then now we can take this out and say content. All right, so let's take a look in our browser and see if it all works. All right, looks like it's broken. So let's see what happened. It may just be, so maybe just continue refreshing. I think it broke on the first modification, the first save, and it's reloading. So let's just wait and see what happens. So it looks like this is not what we want. What did I do? So, yeah. So basically I imported content from navbar. That's not what we want. We want content from content. So you probably saw that before I did, but I'll save this and reload the page. All right, there we go. That's what we expect to see. So there is all of our content. I'll close this just so you can see. It all looks correct. All right. Check the console. There's no issues. You can see the events. We've got some linter warnings here, like Web3 is defined, we never use. We can go ahead and fix that. I'll remove this. All right. And then also network, accounts, and token is never used. So go ahead and remove that. Let's say take accounts away here and remove network. All right. Oh, we got to issue await. Oops, sorry. I forgot to take const away. All right, so let's see. Await. Let's see the other issues. All right. Reload. And let's see the other warnings. So it's saying token is assigned but never used. Okay, so that's fine. We're going to use the token right now, actually. So that refactors all that content into, its own navbar and component. What I want to do now is only load this content if the smart contracts are loaded. All right, let me explain why. Basically, we want to fetch some basic information from the blockchain before we show any of this stuff, right? Because what we're going to do is we're going to break out each of these cards into their own components to like do deposits, to do orders, to list all the orders, to list the price, et cetera, et cetera. And what we want to do is wait for the smart contract to get loaded before we show all this stuff. Because if they're not loaded yet, it's going to be blank. It's going to break, essentially. So that provides us a way to, kind of code defensively and make sure that we're actually injecting data into the components. And also we can use the selectors to provide default values in case something isn't there. Okay. So it's going to give us a way to protect against that. And basically what we'll do is say, only if the contracts are loaded, let's render out the content. Okay. So I'll do that right now. We're going to create a new selector in our selectors file. So we'll go there. And we'll basically say contracts loaded. All right. So we'll say const contracts loaded equals state. All right. And inside of here, we want to make sure that the token is loaded and also that the exchange is loaded. Okay, so we need two different selectors here. All right, so I'm going to comment this out. We don't have everything we need yet. I'll say const token loaded. That's going to equal a state. We'll say get state token dot loaded. All right, and it's going to default to false. All right, and then also, whenever the exchange is loaded, we want to do the same thing. So we'll just say exchange. All right. So now we want to create selectors for each of these. So just like the account selector, do this. And instead of account, we'll say token loaded. And this will be a Boolean, so we'll just call it a Boolean. Or we could say token loaded. Let's do that. TL. Okay. And then same thing here. Just copy this. Say exchange loaded. Exchange loaded. All right, and this will be EL instead of TL. And then inside this selector, we want to check for both of these. So we can just say, token loaded, state, and exchange loaded. All right, instead of doing this, this feels wrong. So I'm actually refactor this ahead of time. So let's actually do export contracts loaded selector. And if you go back to the Redux page, you can see how they do it. You can pass in two different, and then get the return values from each of them. And your return value will be, you can work with both of them to calculate that. So basically, I'll do this. I'll do contracts loaded selector just like this, and we'll pass in the other selectors. So let's say token loaded, and then also exchange loaded, and then I'll pass in a function. We'll say TL and EL. And then inside of here, what we want to do is work with those values. And basically, what I'm going to do is actually, let's not do this. Let's just do this. Let's say TL and EL. All right, so tokens loaded and exchange is loaded. And that will tell us that both smart contracts are loaded, right? And we don't need this anymore. So contracts loaded selector, right? So contracts loaded selector is going to see, is the token loaded, is the exchange loaded? If they both are, we'll select that out, and then that will allow us to determine whether or not we want to render this content, okay? So now we actually need to populate loaded. So how do we do that? Well, I'll give you a hint. We need to trigger an event anytime, or sorry, trigger an action anytime that happens, and we'll do it inside of our interactions. So we actually have it done for us already. We did it in the last section, token loaded and exchange loaded, and we handle that, let's see here, inside of our reducers. So token loaded and exchange loaded. And what we additionally want to do is add another value here. We'll just say loaded. It's true. Oops. All right. Boom. And I don't just want to check for the presence of a smart contract either. I want to actually check for its loaded value initially, because there are going to be other things that we do later in the this project where we reset this value, and I don't want to check for the presence of a smart contract because that isn't always good enough, as we'll see in future use cases. Right now we want to optimize this to use the loaded value. Okay, so I'm just kind of thinking ahead here. All right, so now that's doing what we want, and let's just test it out. Let's go to our app.js component, and let's just check to see if the contracts are loaded. All right, let's just do this, and we'll import the selector, contracts loaded selector. And I'm just going to console log inside of here. I'll say console log contracts, say state. Oops, state. Contracts loaded. All right, let's look at our app. Okay, so we got an issue here. Contracts loaded selector is not exported from store selectors. Let's go back here. Let's see what's going on. Contracts loaded selector. All right, I misspelled it. There we go. Contracts loaded selector. My fault. All right, let's refresh our page and see what happens. All right, so still an issue. Contracts loaded selector is not exported from store selectors. All right, let's see what's going on here. Okay, sorry guys, it's blatant right in front of me. I'm not even thinking. This needs to be this. My fault, I'm sorry. So contracts loaded selector equals create selector, and then pass that in. So if you were horribly confused looking at that earlier, I apologize. But that has fixed the issue. So contracts loaded selector equals create selector. I blame it on too much recording, my fault. So let's save that, go back to the page. All right, it's not broken anymore. Let's look at our console, and we can see the value is true, right? They're loaded. So they were false before, false, 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 and then true. So we can see whenever the token was loaded, it updated that value to true. Look at the diff, right? Not the final result. It was false, now it's true. An exchange was loaded. Well, it was nothing, and now it's true, right? Boom. Awesome. So that's what we want to see. Now we only want to load this section if all the contracts are loaded. And we'll do that like this. Basically, we'll go back to our app.js component, and we will say, we'll check for contracts loaded like this. Like contracts loaded. And we'll basically just paste in our contracts loaded selector. All right, remove this. All right, now that will be accessible inside of props, inside of our render function. All right, so now what we can do is say, we'll use these curly braces to evaluate JavaScript within our markup inside this JSX. So we'll say this.props.contracts loaded, and then question mark. So we're going to use a ternary operator. So a ternary operator in JavaScript is basically just like an inline conditional. So if, then, else, right? So we'll say if the contracts are loaded, question mark, then we want to render out this content. All right, boom. And then if it's not, we want to basically just render out a div that still preserves the styles, but doesn't actually have anything inside of it. So we'll just do a blank div with the same class name, content. We'll do that like this. Boom. All right, so if they're loaded, show the content. If they're not, just show this blank div, right, with the same class name so that it's black. All right, so I'm going to refresh. There we go. You can kind of see a flash where it's initially black, and then the content shows up. So that's exactly what we want to happen. It's basically our loading screen. The nav bar stays there the whole time. That's okay, but the content doesn't, and that's what we want. All right. So there you go. And, while we're here and I made a mention of it, I can show you the JavaScript ternary. This is what I was talking about, the JavaScript ternary. Basically, you just have a conditional that's going to evaluate to true or false. Give it a question mark. If it's true, return this value. If it's false, return this value. And I can put a link to this down in the description of this video for the video resources. So it's the same thing as saying if, else, but it's just inline. It's for simpler stuff. All right. So that's what we want. Now, lastly, before we move on, I want to do one more thing, all right? So I don't want to really touch this app component anymore. I basically want to move on from this and start developing all the components that will fill in all this stuff, okay? So there's one last little bit. We basically want to require that the contract's loaded at all before someone uses the application, right? So if that fails, then we want to render an alert that says, hey, these contracts weren't deployed. So this is also for you guys whenever you're building your exchange. You want to have safeguards so that you know kind of what's happening. You give users feedback that there was an issue, okay? All right, so inside of here, what I'll do, inside this load blockchain data, basically, we're going to render some sort of alert if that hasn't happened, okay? So we need to change something that we did earlier. Inside this interactions file, we're going to refactor this load token and load exchange to look a little bit differently, okay? All right, so if you remember when we did the interactions, when we load the token or load the exchange, we showed this right here. So instead of window.alert, let's change this. So here's what we want to change. Instead of window.alert, let's just do console.log here. All right. Or we could do nothing. It doesn't really matter. What we really want to do is check the return value of this. If it was null, then not inside of this interactions file, but instead in the component, I want to render an alert. And that's because I don't really want to have user-facing interactions inside this file. I'd rather that kind of be the responsibility of the component to show you. Okay, so basically, like, we're doing try and catch, and if it didn't load the token, it's going to return null. And if it did return null, we know there was a problem, and we want to tell the user about it. Okay, so I'll do that in the app like this. Basically, we'll wrap this load token, say const await load token. All right, and then I'll do this. I'll say if bang token. Let's basically just alert the user. All right, so boom. Window.alert, token smart contract not detected on the current network. Please select another network with MetaMask. All right. So let's do that also for the exchange. If the exchange doesn't exist, then we'll do that as well. So we'll say const exchange wait. All right. And then boom, there we go. If the exchange doesn't exist and the exchange smart contract is not detected on the current network, please select another network with MetaMask. Okay. So I'll demonstrate that. Let's actually select a different network. We'll go to the main network, for example. All right, I'll load it and we'll refresh the page. And there we go. We get a nice alert that says, hey, your token is not on this network. All right. You can't use this network. Please select a different network. Okay. We'll do the same thing with the exchange, right? So that's going to give us two advantages. If you're on the wrong network, it'll tell you. And also, if you haven't deployed the smart contract to the blockchain yet for development purposes, it'll also tell you. So I'm not going to illustrate that because I don't want to restart Ganache and rerun my seeds or everything. But it'll at least kind of give you an alert that, hey, something's wrong. And it'll give you pretty good insight on how to debug it. All right, so that's the last thing I wanted to do inside this file before moving on. So in the next videos, we're actually going to start building out these components in here, right? So we need to deposit funds, make orders, list all the open orders, show the prices and the charts, show our trades and orders, and also show all of the filled orders already. So there's a lot of work to do, but you've come a long way so far, and we're going to start moving fast because we've got everything set up on our client side, and we're going to start knocking these things out one by one. So I'll catch you in the next video.